Christendom is a vague term. At its simplest level, it can simply refer to the Christian church worldwide. It doesn't have to carry a connotation, but it does. Christendom today refers to the notion that Christianity won, or that some team's version of Christianity won, and it has its roots in a historical reality. It begins with the unholy union of Christianity and power, the marriage of Christianity and empire. The entire largely Jewish early church faced constant imperial persecution. Martyrdom was kind of the name of the game. But in the year 313, year of our Lord, 313, right? They must have called it something different then. Roman Christians found favor with Constantine the Great, who legalized the faith in the Roman Empire. But it wasn't long before Christianity then became the official religion of the state. To be Christian became a qualification for citizenship. Anybody who wasn't was second class and on down. And next thing you know, nations are fighting wars for religious causes in the name of Jesus. The term Christendom doesn't even appear until the early Middle Ages because it's a geopolitical term. It was about conquest. It was about slaughter, the wholesale slaughter of Muslim and Jewish people in pursuit of the holy lands of the Abrahamic faiths during the Crusades, or the slaughter of dissenting Protestant or Orthodox or Catholic sects in the religious war of Europe. And then it isn't just about controlling Holy Land or controlling the primary voice of Christianity in your region. Next thing you know, it's about dominance of all land. And that kind of brings us back to what we discussed last week, that this supposed superior nature of Christianity became the rationale for colonialism, civilizing, converting, and/or enslaving non-Christian people. And then it finds its natural next step in legitimizing white supremacy and anti-Semitism. Not relevant today at all. Conveniently, the victors are clearly always the most faithful people. And not only did the winners get to write history, in this case, they also got to write theology. And they got to select the canon of sacred texts. They didn't just get to represent the faith of an entire group of people, they got to define it. Christendom has been synonymous with Christianity while also being synonymous with the Western world and Western conquest. What Louis C.K. is naming is how dominant Christianity has been, such that we don't even notice its impact. What he didn't name is the reality that the reason we can actually recognize this now and laugh is because the tide is turning. The joke is ridiculous in a way that it hasn't been for centuries because Christendom is losing ground. For the first time, Christendom is more of a cultural or an intellectual reality. It's a social reality which still exists, still dominates, but for how long? The statistics are backing this up. The Pew Research Center shook Christendom a few years ago with its report that the religiously unaffiliated now include at least a quarter of the US population, mostly among Gen X and millennials, and that number is on the rise. So for a lot of churches, that means that they're closing their buildings. Most denominations are coming up shorter and shorter each year on their budgets in North America and Europe in particular. And this demographic shift tells us, at least tells some people, that the church is dying. So I've been talking about death a lot lately, and not just because I work here and mortality is our favorite subject. Some of you know that I've made some trips home recently to Memphis because my grandmother was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer in July. And when I went home, she gave me her blessing to do her eulogy, and we talked about how she'd like to be remembered, what she'd like me to say about her life. And I asked her if she was afraid to die, and she said, not at all. If I have some unfinished business I don't know about, I guess I'm going to be here. But if this is the end, I'm at peace with that. I like to think I took advantage of the time I had, because all that any of us is promised is this moment. But if you're going to be a gardener, and she always has been, you've got to be an optimist. She's doing great, by the way. She's kicking cancer's ass. When it comes to the waning of the North American church to the fall of Christendom, I wonder if a little death and resurrection might be just what the church needs. If maybe all this talk of waning numbers and shrinking influence means that our empire-building days are over, and if maybe that's a good thing. Maybe the church shouldn't be about power and money and numbers. Maybe being the church is about something else. And maybe dying to those old ways of doing things is exactly what needs to happen. Rachel Held Evans says it like this: I'm not afraid of the church dying. Death is something that empires worry about. It's not something that gardeners worry about. It's certainly not something that resurrection people worry about. As the shape of Christianity changes and our churches adapt to a new world, maybe it's just God creating something new, and that's worth being optimistic about. This isn't uncharted territory in the Christian tradition. It's one of the most consistent themes throughout the biblical narrative, that when the oppressed become the oppressor, God has a way of sending them back to the wilderness. As in the reading from the prophet Hosea today, when the Israelites start to perpetuate injustice, the same God who has led them out of Egypt to freedom sends them back to the wilderness. Israel is conquered by the Assyrians. The tribes of Israel are scattered across the land. They end up back in tents. And Christianity is heading back to the tents again. The wilderness of a new spiritual landscape. God has a tendency in the Bible to humble the powerful. If this is a shift, a rebirth, something new that we want to participate in, just like with issues of social justice or overcoming racism, we have to recognize and name that Christendom is the water that we swim in. We talked last week about inheriting the benefits of white supremacy, that we have to name the ways in which white privilege systematically takes shape. And we have to do this in the same way with Christian supremacy. Or calling back a few more weeks, perhaps those of us who have inherited a lot of Christian language and assumptions might need to be conscious that our spiritual experience or the tradition to which we've become accustomed are like a spider web that we've walked into. It makes total sense for us who are on the inside, but our reaction looks crazy to other people who don't know about the invisible reality of Christendom. We here in this room reject the system of power by which not only non-Christians, but those authentically seeking to connect with the message of Jesus suffer each week in our community statement. By its very virtue, Christendom makes assumptions. You want to play by the rules, right? Be included? Well, you must be a Christian. Everybody is. Everybody like me is. The stifling roar of Christendom does not welcome questions or dialogue, but we affirm each week that the message of Jesus is not meant to conquer or to silence, but to invite and to lift up for all humanity, not just Christianity.
So a few years ago, Stacy and I had a friend who she used to travel with when she was doing recruiting for Stetson, and they went on a trip one time, and as they were checking into a hotel, this guy who's like political correctness police goes up to the check-in desk, and there's like a high school kid there, and he's checking in, and he says, "Do you practice Bible oppression?" This high school kid is like, "Well, I don't even know, like, what do you mean?" He says it again, "What, do you practice Bible oppression?" And the kid's like, I don't know. And so Stacy and some of the other people are like, forgive him, he's, being rude. He's asking if there's a Bible in like the bedside table, like a Gideon Bible. A Bible in every hotel. That's sort of a Christendom thing. And the kid's like, yeah, there's a Bible. And he's like, well, you need to get it out of my room, like before I check in. I don't put up with Bible oppression. So a little bit extreme, but sort of, this idea that this is the water we're swimming in to the extent that in many ways we don't even question it. Up through the 60s, the way that land was developed in the US, when you went to form a new community, say 30,000 lots for houses or whatever you're going to put in a bunch of neighborhoods, the developers would set aside and give away land for churches. Not for temples or mosques or anything else, but when a neighborhood went in, there was always a plot of land for the Catholic Church, Presbyterian Church, Baptist Church, Methodist Church. So they would just give land away. And now the denominations and churches are like, where did they, these days are gone. That's not how things work anymore, but for a long, long time, that was just a part of the way things were. You wanted a community, you had to have a bunch of churches. Anybody have any guess how many churches there are in walking distance from downtown DeLand?
I know there's 2 on my street. There's gotta be like 10.
How many think more than 10? More than 20? More than 30? More than 40? Between 40 and 50, depending on how far you could walk. Right, how many Jewish temples are there in walking distance? Yeah, there's the one. How many Unitarian churches are there in Volusia County? There's like 3 total. There's only 1 in West Volusia. No Baha'i temples. No, yeah, the point being, like, this is the reality we live in. Like, it is so overwhelmingly dominant to Christian faith. David brought up at Occupy Trilogy, American civil religion. So American civil religion is a sociological theory that a non-sectarian, quasi-religious faith exists within the United States with sacred symbols drawn from national history. This is what a lot of you are mentioning. Scholars have portrayed it as a cohesive force, a common set of values that foster social and cultural integration. So from a social theory perspective, this is a great definition of Christendom, even though it doesn't say Christianity anywhere in it. That's sort of what you guys are naming when you say sort of this idea of Christian values, like where the country came from. That's it in many, many ways. And we see this in tons of ways, right? On our money, it says, in whom do we trust, right? Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under, right? When you go to swear in a courtroom, you swear on what? All right? Before there was Make America Great Again, it was who would bless America, right? Joel Osteen's getting a bunch of heat, right, in the news because of the whole stuff and the flood. Whatever you think about that, the fact is the 16,000 mega-seat auditorium arena, that church doesn't pay any tax, right? And neither do we. We get grandfathered into some really sweet deals because of the collusion between the government and the religion. It was years ago, but one of the original, I think, Barna research surveys about Christianity in the United States, the definition of Christian was white and born in America. Are there any national mosques in the United States? No? No national mosques? No? There's no national Buddhist temples. There are no national synagogues, but there are national cathedrals. There are. David also pointed this out. Down at the bottom center, right in the middle between the angel in like purple and the angel in green. Let me see if I have a laser on here. This is George Washington, but not just George Washington. That's George Washington resurrected. Yeah, right? He's coming back. So all of this to say, and sort of a lot of what Caitlin did a great job of articulating, is that part of what Louis C.K., not just what he's saying, but the fact that he can say it and we can laugh at it, means that church as the center is a dying reality, right? This is the waning of what is called Christendom. Why? There's a lot of reasons, and again, she already named some of that stuff. I want to start with just the simple reality that it feels a little slimy, right? And I think we finally had enough time with it and been exposed to versions of Christendom and particular forms of Christianity that we're just like, ah. So I want to do this real quick. Let me read the Christendom version of the community statement and tell me how this feels. We value highly the reality of arrival. We're similar people from similar places and backgrounds, representing a generationally siloed community, and we've traveled basically the same path. So we rightly make assumptions about the person across from us, next to us, and in conversation with us. We don't need to worry about being sensitive because this community includes a homogenous group of people who think and believe like us. We don't mind offending people unlike us, and there's no need to ask questions and articulate responses because we assume fluency in the Bible and spirituality and church language. We believe the message about Jesus is for Christianity and not for humanity, so we do everything we can to make everyone Christian like us. Yeah. I think that's why. That could be the end of the sermon, but I'll talk for a while. So a couple of very specific examples, and just to kind of help us, what I want to do is not just say this is the water we're swimming in, but like we did last week with white supremacy, like we did the week before with trying to understand people different than us and issues of justice, it's not just raising awareness so that we know that it exists, but it's helping us sort of move in the world in ways that we start to see it and can critique this in real time and understand what it is we're participating in. So cultural barriers to meaning. For a long, long time, I'll say Christendom, if we think of this, and so I've sort of got it in a line, but if you think of this as a circle with church at the center and each of these sort of being concentric rings out from the center, language, religion, ethnic history, for a long time, we could say Christendom assumed that all of this took place within church, within Christianity, within Christendom, such that the church, or Christendom, was its own culture. It had its own language, it was its own religion, it had its own assumed ethnic history that everybody shared. And when the church is assumed to be the center, and Christendom and each of these, language, religion, ethnic history, are all assumed to be within this bubble of church, as the world has evolved and progressed, each of these pieces of culture have sort of moved outside of Christendom, or we could say Christendom has continued to shrink. Christendom, and this has sort of now become post-Christian culture. And so the church at the center now of culture is shrinking, and these have each, instead of being within Christendom, have become sort of cultural barriers to meaning or translation or relevance, you could call it. And so each sort of concentric circle out from the center has really become a barrier to people really getting anything from the church. And so we'll come back to that in a second. So what can we do? If we think of this, sort of the time that we're in, as an evolutionary stimulus, the question is, what's the adaptation? So if we start with articulating the difference between position and passion, part of what we're saying is that Christendom is no longer valid because we can no longer assume that Christianity has the pride of place. That you don't get to just be the top of society because you're Christian or because you're the church or whatever it is. And so really what we're talking about is the difference between calling each of these sort of concentric circles here, instead of calling, like if that's the church at the center, instead of calling people from different languages, religions, ethnic history, instead of calling them into Christendom, which is what the church has been doing for the last 100 years, they use words like outreach. Let's go get people that are different, and we'll bring them across these cultural barriers and basically convert them not only to church, but to Christendom, back into this culture. Instead, what would it look like if the church that's at the center, increasingly shrinking, went out into these areas of difference to serve, right? Not to go and get people and bring them back, but just to go and live sort of the way that Jesus lived. I know that's radical, but that's sort of the Mark 10 thing, right? The disciples want to know, who gets the positions? Who gets to be on your right? Who gets to be on your left? Who gets to have status? Who gets to have power? And Jesus essentially says, you missed it, right? This is about serving. It's not about convincing everyone who's different to come in so that you can lord over them. It's about divesting of power, divesting of privilege, divesting of all of that stuff and moving out into the world to serve. This could be called cross-cultural incarnation, right? Sort of the idea in the Christian faith that God is alive in humanity. We would move out into areas of difference. We would cross cultural barriers to go and serve rather than doing what's called cross-cultural extraction, which is we go out and get people, we take them from where they are and we bring them back into the church, convince them to sort of be like us. So Pete Rollins tells us this parable about these three sheep farmers who are invited into a competition where they're competing to build the best sheep pen, and they're all given the same material, and they're given 3 days. And after 3 days, the judges come around, and the first guy has like a pretty decent-sized sheep pen. He says, yeah, I used all the material. I feel pretty good about it. I can fit a lot of sheep. He goes to the second guy, and his sheep pen is like twice the size. And he's like, listen, I maximized the efficiency. This thing is really slick. It's got all the bells and whistles. This is the best sheep pen. Nobody's going to beat this. I definitely win. And they go to the third guy, and he's used almost none of the material, and he's standing in basically a box, and it has no door in or out. Sheep can't get in. And they're like, what are you doing? Like, this is the very worst sheep pen we've ever seen. You might be able to fit like another sheep in here besides yourself. And the guy goes, no, you misunderstand. I'm outside the pen. You're standing in it. And this is such a dynamic shift, but that is what's happening with Christianity, with Christendom, and the understanding of the world, right? That what it is that we're calling faith or life, this is not about a specific location. We have to get everybody into an increasingly shrinking sheep pen, but instead an invitation to carry ourselves in a particular way in every location. That everywhere we are outside of this room, that's where it's happening. It's not about getting people to come from areas of difference in and be like us, convert to our culture. We say in the community statement that the message of Jesus is not for Christianity, not for Christendom, not for an increasingly shrinking bubble, but for humanity, for everyone, for how it is that we're going to live and move in the world. So we can also follow third spaces. And by this I mean, for a long, long time, the church has been assumed to be the third space. This is a very Christendom way of seeing the world. The first space is the home, the second space is your workplace, and for a long time, the third space was the church, right? That was sort of the social center of a culture, but over the last 100 years, that's changed. And so now third spaces are Starbucks and the CrossFit gym and wherever else it is that you're going to find social life and social interaction and live outside of your work and your home. And part of what we can do is follow that instead of resisting it, to live there in those places. There's this really cool story in the book of Acts where Paul says goes into the marketplace and talks with people. Now, Paul was a Jew, and he came from a tradition where he would have been most successful if he had gone to the synagogue. He would have talked to people who were already receptive to his message, but instead he goes and hangs out in the marketplace. And because of that, he's invited into another third space where he can go and have conversations with people and debates, and they can ask questions. So we can follow these third spaces. I think maybe one of the last and most important things, we talk about this in baptism a lot, we need to reverse this. So this is sort of the Christendom order of operations: believe, behave, belong. And this is sort of how you get into the club in Christendom. You come in by believing all the right things. And then once you believe the right things, then you have to stop doing bad things and start doing good things. And you have to wear the t-shirt and do all the rituals. And if you believe the right things and you behave in the right way, then you're allowed to belong. Then you can be a part of the Christendom club. And the word Jesus uses is repentance. It means like to rethink, to think again, to sort of turn this around. We talk at baptism about unconditional belonging. That if the starting point of an invitation to faith, of an invitation of the church, is unconditional belonging, it's a lot like a family, right? You don't kick babies out of a family for misbehaving. That's their job, is to be annoying and misbehave. But you keep them. And what happens is over time, they grow up. And as they grow up, they inherit traditions. They inherit values. They inherit rituals that are a part of being in a family. So unconditional belonging eventually leads to shared behavior, shared socialization in a group. And then over time, they probably come to believe some of the same things, but they also have the freedom to question the things that their family has taught them to believe. This is a very different way of understanding faith than the Christendom model. So back to this question. Once we've seen it, how can we challenge this water we're swimming in for the sake of something better? I think it has to be sort of a balance between living as hospice chaplains and midwives. As Caitlin shared, this sort of idea from Rachel Held Evans, that we have to be increasingly comfortable with letting the way things are die, right? Christendom is passing. The idea of a Christian world is increasingly less the norm in our culture, but at the same time, it's not just letting that way of being die, it's participating in bringing about something else. The difference between empires and gardeners, right? We don't feel like we have to defend what is. We can let it go and trust that something else will come out of the soil. And that takes immense faith, especially if you've got a vested interest in Christendom. We can also rethink what Christendom has handed down. We can participate in the most important issues facing the church, right? If the church is going to have anything to say in an increasingly post-Christian world, we have to rethink not just the style, right? Not just the medium, but we've got to rethink the content. We've got to rethink the substance of the Christian faith, because people can smell it a mile away. If we're saying the same old stuff, but we've got laser light shows and like really dynamic people talking, not me. And so part of what we're going to do, moving into the fall, we're going to spend, I think, 8 or 9 or 10 weeks, something like that. First, taking 4 weeks and just kind of looking at really foundational concepts in the Christian faith. but with the assumption that Christendom is dying. And so what does it mean, as Christendom is passing away, what does it mean to think about the narrative of the Christian faith, about the Bible, about Jesus, about the word gospel? And then we're going to move from there and ask questions about some of the most pressing issues, not just for the Christian religion, but for the world that we're living in now. Sexuality, pluralism, our understanding of the future, how it is that we understand science, right? Which I'm fascinated in trying to talk about things like what is supernatural when we're learning what we are about quantum physics. How does that go together? I don't have any idea. But we need to be talking about that instead of going, la, 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 no science, just God, ha. That's what so much of religion has done for so long. Like, I don't understand it, so it's not a thing, and it's just God. Like Caitlin said, well, it's just God. That's how, we need to learn anything. It's just God is doing it. No, right? We should be on the cutting edge of understanding how our faith intersects with the world that we're actually living in, not the world that was around 300 years ago. And I think, finally, we need to let Christ, that was my favorite part of the clip. We need to let Christ become Christendom's greatest critique. This is probably a really familiar passage if you've been around the church for a while, but I want to present it to you in a very specific way, because I didn't see this until I read it this week with this lens. So in Philippians 2, this is like sort of a poem about sort of this grandiose vision of Christ and what Christ is and does. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as in Christ Jesus. Okay. Who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. All right, so let's take this, whatever you think about it, whatever your background or whatever, let's say this is at some point a foundational understanding of the Christian narrative. That is Christ, right? Sort of this is the story that we've got. The passage goes on, though. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So, Christ, equal with God but entirely self-emptying as a servant. Christendom, exalted to the highest place, over everyone, people on their knees. Now, these are in the same passage, but what I want to say is this. This, especially this part, this is an ecstatic, hyperbolic response to the humility of Christ, right? The self-emptying, self-sacrifice, self-giving love. This is hyperbole, and Christendom was brilliant because they used this as technology. This was meant to be poetic, an ecstatic, joyous celebration of the humility of Christ. And Christendom saw this and went, my God, if all we need is to use the name of Christ to make the nations bow, what a brilliant technology. But it was never meant to be this. If the empire behaved like Christ, they would lose all power. And if Christ behaved like the empire, we would rightly have no faith in him. And yet somehow they've come together in really sick and twisted ways. This difference between self-aggrandizing and self-emptying. This is the difference between Christ and Christendom. Christ, this version, especially this idea that the name of God is not something to be used to our own advantage. Just without that, there is no Christendom. And yet that's at the core of the understanding of Christ, and it's been wholesale missed by the way it's been imperialized and colonialized. Christendom has depended forever upon empire, upon power, upon status, upon position, upon privilege. And so the weekly rehearsal of the Eucharist has been, over the centuries, perverted to become a symbol of victory, almost a symbol of oppression, almost a threat. If you don't get in line, that'll happen to you. This very power and position that allowed a religion to lord over in the name of the very Christ who is crucified, broken and bled, not victory but death, not salvation but forgiveness. If Christendom is the collusion of religion and power to establish an in-group and then colonialize the world with it, crucifixion is the loss of both religion and power. Even identity. This is the symbol of the absolute outsider, crucified, stripped naked, mocked, taken outside of the city, no longer citizen, cursed of God, abandoned by all. Right? Jesus' final words, my God, why have you forsaken me? Right? You don't say that from the White House. This is not a position of power. Jesus did not use God to his own advantage. He loses everything for God, and on the cross loses everything, including God. And very quickly, Christendom comes along and perfects using God to our advantage. It perfects becoming the ones who crucify. Perfects becoming the very empire Jesus stood against. And if we hear nothing else, what we need to be reminded of is that Christianity, as opposed to Christendom, Christianity, especially that holds at its heart crucifixion, is not a path to power. It's an invitation to humility. And so the Eucharist can't be a symbol of privilege, of pride, or of position. It is not self-aggrandizing. It is self-giving. It's about serving. It's not about the love of power, but the power of love. When Jesus breaks the bread and shares the cup with his friends, he gives thanks and he says, "This is my body given for you." And in the same way with the cup, my blood shed. We can hardly imagine that what he envisioned was a movement to follow where his friends would become the very religious power that killed him. Instead, remember me as a radical invitation to embrace the decentering of faith. No longer the assumption that it is at the heart of all culture. To embrace unconditional belonging, to embrace the weak power of service, and to embrace this counterintuitive invitation to let it die so that we can trust the soil to bring something better. Christianity didn't win, and Christianity isn't going to die. Neither of these extremes are true. Yes, Christendom won. Christendom won for a while. It got the power, it got the privilege, it got the pride of place, and it has each and every skeleton in its closet to answer for. This is our tradition too. We can't stand apart from it and throw rocks at it. This is where we come from. And yes, Christendom is dying. It's on its way out. And part of what we're celebrating tonight is thank God that Christendom is not the only or final expression of the Christian movement, of the way of Jesus. Thank God that the best thing we can do is let it die, so that the cosmic Christ and the ground of being and the spirit that animates the church can live whatever life comes after this death. The table of this death and this hope is the table we set tonight. It's the table of a love that does not use to its own advantage, but gives itself up for service, even to the point of death, to allow for a new way of being. As always, this table is set for us, but it is open to us and to all people. And no one will ever be turned away. When you're ready, feel free to come and grab a piece of bread and dip it in the cup.